All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Jean Trounstine. Jean is an activist, a professor, and the author of several books. Her latest is Boy with a Knife, a story of murder, remorse, and a prisoner's fight for justice. You can find it at jeantrounstine.com. Jean, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Matthew.
All right, so Jean, let's begin by discussing some sort of baseline statistics and a brief history of children being tried as adults here in the United States.
Well, when I first started this project, the number was 250,000 kids every year were tried, sentenced, went to adult prisons. It's now down to 200,000. Part of that is because the crime has dropped, and I can get into that in a little bit. Juvenile crime has dropped, but we figure 10,000 people a day, kids a day, actually go through the system, whether they're charged as adults, tried as adults, found guilty as adults. And that's a pretty staggering number of kids.
And if I'm correct, in the United States, it actually varies from state to state, but children as young as 14 can theoretically be tried as adults here in the United States, correct?
Well, actually, the number in Massachusetts, the number is 14.
Okay.
The age is 14, but there are some states that try children as young as 12.
Wow.
Automatically, they go if they're charged for murder. For capital crimes. But that's pretty young. If you think of your 12-year-old.
Yeah, no, it's extremely young, and I mean, kind of one of the core kind of parts of the book is the idea of, can someone who's a teenager change? And I just reading the book, I'm like, man, I remember myself changing very much from 14 to 15, from 15 to 16, from 16 to 17, not even like the decades that these children are eventually sentenced with, but the idea that no one is the same person they are when they were a teenager that they are as an adult. There literally is no one who is the exact same person. You are, it just the fact that that's so punitive and so crazy that we think of children as adults, and we're like one of the only 3 countries in the world that does that, correct?
Well, yes. I mean, at this point in time, when we talk about sentencing, when we talk about the quote-unquote civilized world, we talk about countries that have very different policies than the United States. If you look at Germany, for example, they'll say that punishment is not even part of the equation, meaning that rehabilitation, getting somebody ready to come back out into society is really the goal. And I think one of the things that's important to say is this does not mean that a crime that someone commits is any less horrific. I think sometimes we get confused, or people get confused. They often say to me, what about the person who was killed? Who cares about the person who went to prison? Why are we talking about that person? And I think my answer is that once a horrific crime has been committed, I mean, obviously we want to stop such crimes, but once something happens and harm is created, I think as a society we have to think, what's the best way of getting rid of that harm in a much deeper sense, to get rid of the harm for the community, for the victim's family, and for the perpetrator's family? Because in the case of the young man that I talk about in my book, his family was also essentially victimized by his crime. They were stoned, they had to move out of their house, kids couldn't go to school, brothers and sisters. And the creation of harm is one thing, and the dealing with the harm is the other thing.
Yeah, the idea that justice should be a more restorative justice as opposed to a punitive justice, essentially.
Yeah. I think that's really something that I'm more and more understanding and advocating for. That I was at a reading the other night, and someone said to me, she told me about how her cousin had been murdered. No, maybe it was her nephew. A nephew had been murdered, excuse me. And it wasn't until her family, she said, went to the judge and asked that he be out of prison that they started to heal. And I thought that was really interesting because the creation of more harm, the idea that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that concept, I don't think that is really the way we heal as human beings. I don't heal when something horrific is, when I'm angry and furious at someone, I don't really, there's a little bit of sense for some period of time of feeling glad that someone is hurt when you've been hurt by them, but not really. It doesn't really heal. It just gives you a sort of triumphant feeling for a moment. And I'm interested in healing.
Yeah, and not even, and I agree with you. I agree with you 100% on that. But then when we're also talking specifically in your book, I think that's what we should be striving for overall in our justice system. But specifically narrowing it even down further to children, it gets even crazier that we treat children as adults. Like, what are some of the consequences of treating children like adults within our criminal justice system?
Okay. Well, I wanted to say one thing. Massachusetts is actually pretty good on some of these things and very bad on other things. What they're about, I'll start with the bad. In Massachusetts, there's an estimate that if you are a person of color, you are 9 times more likely than a white kid to get any of the things we're talking about in the system at all, in terms of going to prison as an adult, being tried as an adult, being sentenced as an adult, getting out. So 9 times worse for a person of color. When you actually do time in an adult prison, and in Massachusetts, if you're sentenced as an adult, let's just take the recent Philip Chisholm trial. He was sentenced he was 14 when he committed his crime, 16 when he went to prison. He would go to a juvenile facility until he was 18 and then go to an adult prison. He would risk rape, abuse, and a lot of people, I use this example just because what happens is so many people are then confronted with, well, I don't care what happens to him. And this is exactly the problem, that these kids are still 16 or 15 or 17. And when they're 18, even when they're 18, they are put in places where they have to deal with violence, isolation, fewer visits, not the kind of education you would get if you were with your peers, not the kind of counseling you would get in a juvenile facility. And of course, this varies enormously around the country. In Massachusetts, kids can come up for parole if they're they were given first-degree murder at 25 years, 25 years, second-degree murder, 15 years. In some states, you might not come up for parole for 50 years. So the chance for change is diminished, and the opportunities for change are diminished.